It was a quiet October evening in 1998 when a nurse at a children's hospital in San Francisco received a phone call that would change her entire shift. The voice on the other end was soft, almost shy, almost apologetic. The man asked if there were any children on the ward who might want a visitor that night. He did not give his full name. He only said, "Tell them a friend is coming." 20 minutes later, a man in a worn flannel shirt and faded blue jeans walked through the back entrance of the hospital, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He carried no entourage. He carried no cameras. He carried only a small canvas bag filled with rubber chickens, silly hats, and a stuffed monkey that squeaked when you pressed its belly. The nurse looked up, blinked twice, and felt her hands begin to tremble. The man standing in front of her was Robin Williams, and on the third floor of that hospital, in a small room lit only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp, a 9-year-old boy named Daniel was about to receive the visit that his mother would later describe as the most important night of his short life. But this is not just a story about a famous actor visiting a sick child. This is a story about a man who carried his own quiet storms, walking into a room where another soul was fading and giving everything he had left to make that soul laugh one more time. This is the story of how Robin Williams, the man who made the world laugh until it cried, once made a dying boy laugh until that boy forgot, just for a moment, that he was dying at all. And it is the story of what happened after Robin left that hospital room, what he did in the parking lot, alone, in the dark, where no one was supposed to see him. How could a man who gave so much joy carry so much unseen pain? To understand the weight of that night in October, you have to understand the weight Robin Williams had been carrying his entire life. Long before the awards, long before the standing ovations, long before the world knew his face, Robin was a quiet boy growing up in a large, empty house in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. His father worked long hours as an executive at a car company. His mother was warm but often distant, lost in her own world of charity events and social obligations. The house had more rooms than people, and Robin spent most of his childhood alone, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than any sound. He was a shy child, almost painfully shy. Other kids at school called him chubby and laughed at the way he stumbled over his words. He was the boy who sat at the back of the classroom, hoping no one would call on him. He was the boy who ate lunch alone on the bench by the playground. He was the boy who came home every day, walked up the long staircase, closed the door to his bedroom, and disappeared into a world only he could see. In that bedroom, Robin built entire universes out of his imagination. He had a collection of toy soldiers, more than 2,000 of them, and he gave each one a different voice. He acted out battles, romances, betrayals, and reunions. He created characters who spoke in accents he had never heard in real life. He invented stories where the lonely boy always saved the day. The toy soldiers were his only audience, and they never laughed at him. They only listened. But the gift that made people laugh would one day become impossible to turn off. By the time Robin was a teenager, his family had moved to California, and something inside him had begun to change. He discovered that he could make other students laugh. He discovered that humor was a kind of armor, a way to be seen without being judged. He discovered that if he made the joke first, no one else could make the joke about him, and so he became the funny one, the fast one, the boy whose mouth could not stop moving because his mind could not stop racing. He started taking acting classes. He attended Juilliard, the prestigious performing arts school in New York City, where his teachers told him that no one had ever seen anything quite like him. He could shift between characters in seconds. He could make a room of strangers feel like old friends. He could turn an empty stage into a circus, a war zone, a love story, a comedy, all in a single breath. But behind the speed, there was something deeper. There was a sensitivity that none of his classmates fully understood. There was a sadness that lived just behind his eyes, a sadness he never spoke about, a sadness he chose to transform into laughter every single time he stepped onto a stage. By the late 1970s, Robin Williams had become a phenomenon. His role as a strange alien named Mork in a television show called Mork and Mindy made him a household name across America. Children memorized his catchphrases. Adults could not believe how fast his mind worked. He was invited onto every late-night talk show. He was offered film roles before he had even finished his television contract. He was, in every measurable way, becoming a star. And then came the films: Good Morning Vietnam, Dead Poets Society, Mrs. Doubtfire, Aladdin, Jumanji, Good Will Hunting. Each role revealed another layer of who Robin Williams really was. Audiences came for the comedy, but they stayed for something else. They stayed because Robin understood pain. They stayed because when his characters cried, the tears felt real. They stayed because somewhere inside that fast, talking, wild-eyed performer, there was a man who knew exactly what it felt like to feel small, to feel alone, to feel afraid. The world came for the jokes, but it stayed because he understood pain. And nowhere was that understanding more visible than in the way Robin Williams treated the people the world had forgotten. He visited homeless shelters without telling anyone. He gave money to struggling actors who could not pay their rent. He wrote letters to fans who had written to him about their depression, their grief, their loneliness. He made phone calls to strangers in hospitals just to hear them laugh. And he visited children. He visited so many sick children that hospitals across the country had unofficial protocols for what to do when Robin Williams called. Do not announce his visit. Do not allow photographs. Do not let the press find out. Just open the back door, escort him quietly to the children's ward, and let him do what only he could do. Which brings us back to that October night in 1998. Daniel was 9 years old. He had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer when he was 7, and for 2 years he had been in and out of hospitals, fighting a battle that no child should ever have to fight. His mother, a single woman named Catherine who worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment, had spent every spare moment by his bedside. His father had left when Daniel was just a baby, and so it had always been just the 2 of them, mother and son. Against everything the world threw at them, Daniel was a quiet boy, much like Robin had been at the same age. He loved books. He loved drawing. He loved old movies, the kind his mother used to watch with him when the chemotherapy made him too weak to do anything else. And his absolute favorite movie in the world was a film about a man who pretended to be a British nanny so he could see his children. The film was called Mrs. Doubtfire. Daniel had seen it more than 40 times. He could recite every line. He could imitate the voice of the old woman with the gray hair and the sweet smile. When the pain became too much to bear, his mother would put the movie on, and Daniel would fall asleep to the sound of Robin Williams making him laugh. By October of 1998, the doctors had run out of treatments. They told Catherine, gently, that Daniel had only a few weeks left. Maybe a month. Maybe less. They moved him to a private room on the 3rd floor, the room where the hospital sent children who were not going to go home again. Catherine sat by his bedside every night, holding his small hand, trying not to cry where he could see her. She did not know what to say to him. She did not know how to prepare a 9-year-old boy for the end of his life. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. Oh. She put on his favorite movie, and one of the night nurses, a woman named Margaret who had been working at the hospital for almost 30 years, walked past the room and saw the glow of the television and heard the familiar voice of Robin Williams, coming through the door. She paused. She watched Daniel for a moment, his eyes barely open, his breathing shallow, his small hand resting in his mother's. And then Margaret made a decision. She walked to the nurse's station, picked up the phone, and called a number she had been given years before by a representative of an actor who had asked, very privately, to be contacted whenever a child on the ward might need a visit. Margaret did not expect a response. She had made calls like this before, to other numbers, for other children. Sometimes the calls went to voicemail. Sometimes the assistant on the other end took a polite message and nothing ever came of it. Margaret understood. Famous people had busy lives. They could not drop everything every time a nurse on a hospital ward thought a child might need a visit. But Margaret made the call anyway, because she had been a nurse for almost 3 decades, and she had learned that you never stop trying. You never assume that hope is wasted. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. It was a soft voice, almost shy. The voice said only, "I can be there in 3 hours." "Is that all right?" Margaret said yes. Then she hung up the phone, walked into the bathroom at the end of the hallway, locked the door, and cried for a full minute before walking back to her station and continuing her shift as if nothing had happened. 3 hours later, Robin Williams was sitting on the edge of Daniel's hospital bed. He had brought the canvas bag with him. He had brought the rubber chickens and the silly hats and the squeaky monkey. He had brought a small picture book about a magical lamp and a genie who could grant any wish. He had brought a notebook and a pen, in case Daniel wanted to draw with him, and he had brought himself, the whole of himself. Every voice, every character, every ounce of energy he had left in his body that night. Daniel did not believe his eyes when Robin walked in. The boy who had watched Mrs. Doubtfire 40 times, who had memorized every line, who had whispered the dialogue along with the screen during his worst nights of pain, was suddenly looking at the man behind the voice. Daniel tried to sit up. He could not. He was too weak. So Robin sat down on the edge of the bed, leaned close, and in the exact voice of the old British nanny, he said, "Hello, dear. I heard there was a young gentleman on this floor who needed a bit of nonsense tonight. Would that happen to be you?" Daniel laughed. It was a small laugh, weak and tired, but it was a laugh. And Catherine, sitting in the corner of the room, put her hand over her mouth and began to cry silently, because she had not heard her son laugh like that in months. The sound of that laugh was something Catherine would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was the sound of a small piece of joy fighting its way through layers and layers of pain. It was the sound of her son becoming, just for a moment, the boy he used to be before the diagnosis, before the hospitals, before the long nights, when she had stayed awake watching him breathe. For the next 2 hours, Robin Williams gave that little boy a private show that no audience in the world would ever see. He pulled the squeaky monkey out of his bag and made it argue with the rubber chicken about who got to sit on the windowsill. He put on different hats and became different characters. He was a French chef who could not pronounce the word omelette. He was a cowboy who was secretly afraid of horses. He was a robot from outer space who had come to Earth, specifically to find the best ice cream in San Francisco. Daniel laughed and laughed. His mother laughed too, through her tears. Even the nurses, who had stopped doing their rounds and were standing in the hallway just outside the door, were laughing. But the laughter was real, and so was the pressure. Because Robin knew, even as he was making this child laugh, that this was probably the last time anyone would ever make this child laugh. He knew it the way only someone who has stood at the edge of his own darkness can know it. And so he gave more. He gave faster. He gave louder. He gave everything. After about an hour, Daniel grew tired. His eyes began to close. Robin slowed down. He sat very still on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy with an expression so tender that Catherine would later say, "It was like watching a father look at a son." "Are you sleepy, my friend?" Robin asked, in his own voice now, soft and warm and unhurried. Daniel nodded. "Want me to read you something?" Robin asked. Daniel nodded again. So Robin opened the small picture book he had brought. It was a book about a genie. He read the story slowly, doing all the voices, but quietly, gently, the way a parent reads to a child who is almost asleep. When the story was over, Daniel was almost gone into sleep. But he opened his eyes one more time, and he reached out his small hand, and he placed it on Robin's hand. And he said, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "Thank you for being my friend." Robin Williams, the man who had made the world laugh, the man who had won an Academy Award, the man who could improvise for hours without ever running out of words, did not say anything. He could not say anything. He just held the boy's hand. And he stayed there, on the edge of that bed, for another 20 minutes, until Daniel had fallen completely asleep. Then he carefully, gently, placed the boy's hand back on the blanket. He stood up. He turned to Catherine, who was still sitting in the corner, still crying. He walked over to her, knelt down in front of her chair, and took both of her hands in his. He did not give her a speech. He did not offer her empty words about how everything would be okay. He just looked into her eyes and said, "He is so loved. Anyone can see how loved he is. You did that. You are the reason he knows what love feels like." And then he hugged her. He hugged her for a long time, the way a brother hugs a sister who has lost everything. He left the room. He walked down the long hallway, past the nurses, who tried to thank him but could not find the words. He walked down 3 flights of stairs because he did not want to wait for the elevator. He walked out the back entrance of the hospital, into the cold October night, and he walked across the empty parking lot to his car. And then, in the darkness, with no one around to see him, Robin Williams sat down on the curb next to his car, and he cried. He cried for a long time. He cried the way a man cries when he has been holding something in for too many years. He cried because he had just held a dying child's hand. He cried because he knew the boy would not see Christmas. He cried because the world is unfair, and children should not have to die, and mothers should not have to bury their sons, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that Robin Williams or anyone else could do to change that. A security guard noticed him from across the parking lot. The guard had been doing his rounds and had spotted what looked like a man in distress sitting on the curb. He started to walk over, ready to help, but as he got closer, he recognized the famous face, even in the dim light of the parking lot lamp. The guard stopped. He understood. He turned around quietly and walked back the other way, leaving the man alone with his grief, because some moments are too sacred to interrupt. But even love from millions could not answer everything. Daniel passed away 11 days later. Catherine was holding his hand when it happened, and she would tell people for the rest of her life that her son had died smiling, because for those 11 days after Robin's visit, Daniel had been a different child, lighter, happier, less afraid. He had told the nurses about the rubber chicken and the squeaky monkey. He had told his mother about the French chef who could not pronounce omelette. He had drawn pictures of the cowboy and the robot. The pictures were taped to the wall above his bed when he died. Catherine wrote a letter to Robin 2 weeks after the funeral. She did not know if it would ever reach him. She sent it through the hospital, hoping someone would forward it to the right place. In the letter, she thanked him. She told him what those 11 days had meant to her son. She told him that Daniel had asked, the day before he died, if Robin would be sad when he heard the news. "Tell him not to be sad," Daniel had said. "Tell him I will tell the angels his jokes." Robin received the letter. He kept it in a drawer in his desk for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about Daniel. He never told the story in interviews. He never tried to use that night for anything other than what it had been. A small, holy, private moment between two souls who needed each other, in a room where the rest of the world could not see. After that night, Robin visited even more children. He set up an arrangement with several hospitals across the country, asking that he be called whenever a child wanted a visit. He did not tell anyone. He did not write about it in his autobiography. He did not mention it on talk shows. The only people who knew were the nurses, the families, and the children themselves. Some of those children survived. Many of them did not. But every single one of them, when asked years later about the day Robin Williams came to their hospital room, would say the same thing. They would say that for one afternoon, or one evening, or one quiet morning, they had not felt sick. They had not felt scared. They had felt like themselves again. The world saw Robin Williams as a comedian, as a movie star, as one of the funniest men who had ever lived. But the truth, the deeper truth that only a few people ever fully understood, was this: Robin Williams was a healer. He could not cure cancer. He could not stop death. He could not undo the unfairness of a world that allows children to suffer. But he could, for a few precious hours, make a dying boy forget that he was dying. And that, in the end, was the gift Robin Williams gave to the world. Not just laughter, not just movies, but the simple, sacred, impossible gift of making people feel less alone. He carried his own pain. He fought his own battles, the kind of battles that no one fully saw. In his final years, he struggled with a quiet illness that took its toll on him in ways the public would not understand until much later. He passed away in August of 2014, leaving behind a world that suddenly realized it had taken him for granted. A world that suddenly understood that the man who had made everyone laugh had been carrying so much sorrow of his own. But the children he visited, the families he comforted, the strangers he wrote letters to, the friends he called in the middle of the night, just to check in, all of them remembered something the world sometimes forgot. They remembered that Robin Williams was not just funny. He was kind, and kindness, in a world that often forgets to be kind, is the rarest gift of all. Catherine still has the letter Robin wrote back to her 2 months after Daniel passed away. It was a short letter, only a few sentences, but the last line of that letter is something she has read every single day for more than 20 years. The last line said, "Daniel was my friend too. Tell him, when you see him again, that I am still telling his jokes." That is who Robin Williams was. That is the man behind the laughter. That is the truth the world is still learning, even now, even after all these years. He did not just make people laugh. He made people feel seen. And in a hospital room in San Francisco, on a quiet October night in 1998, he made a dying boy feel like the most important person in the world. That is the legacy of Robin Williams, not the awards, not the films, not even the laughter. The legacy is the love. The legacy is the kindness. The legacy is the man who walked into a room full of pain and somehow, impossibly, filled it with light. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you have lost or someone you still have time to love, share it with them. Tell them they are seen. Tell them they matter. Because somewhere, in some small way, that is what Robin would have wanted. He spent his whole life telling the world that nobody had to feel alone. The least we can do is keep telling each other the same thing every single day, for as long as we are here.